My encounter happened in August of 1972 in Lemon Valley, Nevada. Lemon Valley sits northwest of Reno along US 395. Today, the area is covered with housing developments, but back in 1972, there were only two developed areas in the valley: Stead Air Force Base on the west side and the community of Lemon Valley on the east. It was early afternoon on a bright, hot August day, about 85 degrees Fahrenheit, with barely any wind. I was 12 years old, hiking with my 10-year-old brother and our new neighbor David, who was also 12. For years, my brother and I had spent our summers exploring the surrounding hills and valleys. We knew the best places to catch different kinds of lizards, where to find arrowheads, and where to dig through 1800s-era trash dumps for old bottles. We even knew where to look for spent shell casings from the days when the airbase was active. Though we didn't often venture as far as the dry washes, we made exceptions now and then because they were great for spotting scorpions and other interesting finds. That summer, we had just moved from Stead to the Lemon Valley side, and since David was new to the area, we decided to take him all the way out to the closest wash. As we neared one of the shallower entry points, we scanned the ground for horned toads, arrowheads, or anything else that might be interesting. My brother and I had always been competitive when it came to finding arrowheads, and we were completely focused on the ground when the atmosphere suddenly shifted. I don't know if I heard someone gasp or if everything just went too quiet, but something felt wrong. I had a sense of where my brother was, just a few feet behind me, so I turned to look at him. As I rotated from north to south, my eyes first landed on David, about 25 feet away, standing near the rim of the wash. Then my gaze shifted to a giant figure standing just 8 feet away from him, only 3 feet from the wash. Finally, I turned to my brother, who stood 5 feet behind me, eyes wide with panic. The figure was all black and massive, standing completely still, facing me, arms at its sides, staring directly at me. David was frozen in shock, his mouth hanging wide open. My brother, on the other hand, looked ready to bolt. His wide eyes darted from the man to me, then back to David. I took a reflexive step to run too, but I quickly realized that David wasn't moving. If this thing did make a move, he was vulnerable, and we couldn't just leave him there. My mind tried to process what I was seeing. A man, standing out here in the middle of nowhere? There were a lot of strange drifters around Reno, and in the desert, an out-of-place person was immediately considered dangerous. My instincts told me to stand my ground and gauge his intent. The entire moment lasted maybe a second, but it felt much longer. Then my brother screamed, "That's not a man! That's not a man!" Still locked in eye contact with the figure, I shot back, "Yes, it is." "No, it's not," he yelled again. Frustrated, I snapped, "Then what is it?" That shut him up. At that moment, I needed this to be a man. I had to make sense of it. And more importantly, I had to control the fear, both mine and my brother's, because we still had to get David out of there. The figure never moved, never made a sound. But his posture wasn't threatening, more annoyed than anything. It was as if we had disturbed him, and he was assessing whether we were a threat. He just wanted us to leave. We were more than happy to oblige, but David still wasn't moving, so we stood there in an awkward standoff, just staring at each other. From what I could see, the figure was at least 8.5 feet tall, with broad shoulders about 3.5 to 4 feet wide, tapering down to a narrower waist. His arms were so long they reached the tops of his knees. And then there was the strangest part, his clothing. In the middle of a blazing hot August afternoon, in the middle of the desert, this man appeared to be wearing a black down ski parka with the hood up, matching black ski pants and gloves. Back then, down ski wear was a new fad among the skiers who came through Reno. I thought it was odd that he had such a brand new looking outfit, especially one that fit his massive frame. My mind immediately jumped to the assumption that he had stolen it. Given that we were miles from the nearest road, with no vehicles in sight, I had already labeled him a drifter. Maybe he was homeless, and the ski suit was all he had to wear. Desert nights could get chilly, even in August. The dirt on his clothing made sense. He had probably been sleeping on the ground. But something about him didn't fit the profile of a homeless man. His posture was too strong, his shoulders back, standing tall, exuding a quiet authority. His presence felt regal in a way that didn't match a transient. His gaze was intelligent, steady, and beneath the bulk of his clothing, if it was clothing, he was massively built. The kind of broad, muscled proportions you'd expect from a world-class athlete. For a brief second, the thought crossed my mind. Am I looking at fur-covered muscle? I immediately dismissed it. But now, I started looking closer. Before I could process it further, the figure abruptly turned, stepped down into the wash, and walked away without so much as a glance back. There was no indication that he had decided our encounter was over. No shifting weight, no change in stance. One second he was staring at us, the next he simply turned and left. Within a few steps, he disappeared around a slight curve in the wash, vanishing from sight. We had stood there, staring at each other, for maybe 45 seconds. For a moment, none of us moved. I wanted to make sure he was gone before checking on David, who was still frozen in place. My brother followed as I walked up to him. His face was pale, his body stiff. I asked if he was okay. He just nodded. My brother then crept to the edge of the wash, peering down its length. "Can you still see him?" I asked. He shook his head. The figure was gone. As we started to leave, curiosity got the better of us. My brother asked, "What do you think he was doing down there?" I wanted to know too. We followed the wash for 100 yards or so to make sure he wasn't hiding nearby. When we were certain the coast was clear, we dropped into the wash to look for signs of a camp. Nothing. No fire pit, no food wrappers, no trash, no footprints in the granite sand, no evidence that a human had been staying there. What we did find was strange. Someone had embedded tumbleweeds and branches into the wall of the wash, forming a half oval about 4.5 feet high. More brush was arranged in a similar shape on the ground, forming a small shelter big enough for someone to sit cross-legged inside. At the time, I had never heard of Bigfoot. It never even crossed my mind that this thing could be something other than a man. Even though so much of what I had seen didn't make sense, I convinced myself it was just a large, dark-skinned hobo. Because really, what else could it have been? A Sasquatch screamed in my face. Recently, I shared a video by Virgil Candide in which he recounts his 2003 encounter with a female loup-garou on a road in France. After releasing this story, I was contacted by another witness who wanted to share his own experiences, hoping to connect with others who have had similar encounters. This witness, Daniel, not only shares his experience, but also his thoughts and theories. Here's Daniel's story. My name is Daniel, and I'm an Englishman living in Bordeaux, France, where I've resided for the past 26 years. In March 2014, I traveled to the United States to receive prophetic counseling in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Before my trip, I looked up Coeur d'Alene on YouTube and was surprised to see multiple videos of Sasquatch sightings appear alongside my search. Since childhood, I've always had a deep fear of the paranormal, and the idea of encountering a Sasquatch while in Idaho unsettled me. Thankfully, I didn't see one during my stay. Instead, I spent 2 weeks appreciating the beauty of Coeur d'Alene and the kindness of its people, leaving me with fond memories. After Idaho, I flew to Los Angeles for another 2 weeks to meet a friend from Facebook, someone I had never met in person before. Since she didn't have room for me to stay at her place, I reached out to a woman I had met in Bordeaux a few months earlier. She lived nearby and had offered me a place to stay through couch surfing. She lived in Santa Clarita, a small community about 45 minutes outside of Los Angeles. I stayed in a guest room attached to the garage behind her house. The area had a golf course nearby, and if I remember correctly, a small field, but not much in the way of forests. Then came the night of my experience. It was either March 17th or 18th when I went to bed as usual. But at some point in my sleep, I suddenly found myself standing inside the garage. There, in the darkness just a few feet away, was a massive figure. I knew instantly it was a Sasquatch. He stood between 7 and 8 feet tall, and I was absolutely petrified. He made a sound, something vocal, but not quite a full roar. It was a strange mix between a roar and a warble, almost like a warning. Overcome with terror, I did the only thing I could think of. I yelled back, mimicking the same sound as best as I could. And just like that, I was back in my room, sweating and trembling. I sat up, turned on the light, and saw nothing. I don't remember whether I checked the garage immediately or waited until morning. Either way, I brushed it off, assuming my mind had played tricks on me due to my pre-existing fear of Sasquatch. 2 days later, as I stood in the kitchen talking with my host, she casually mentioned something that sent a chill down my spine. "A couple of nights ago, I heard this strange creature outside my house," she said. My mind instantly made the connection. I needed to confirm it. "Did it sound like this?" I asked, attempting my best imitation of the Sasquatch's warble/roar. Her eyes widened in shock. "Yeah," she exclaimed. She then explained that just outside her bedroom window, there was a field. She had heard an actual sound coming from what she believed was a flesh and blood creature. Meanwhile, I had heard the same thing, but only in what seemed like a spiritual experience. Even now, the memory is both hazy and vivid at the same time. I'm convinced that what I had was not a physical encounter, but a paranormal one. Because of this, I have never had to relive the fear I felt that night. Like many Sasquatch encounters, it left me with more questions than answers. Did God allow this experience to reveal the truth about Sasquatch? I don't know. Was this creature sent by dark forces to harm me, only for God to protect me? I don't know. Who transported both of us into the garage? God, the devil, or the Sasquatch itself? I don't know. But one thing is clear to me. Sasquatch is a paranormal phenomenon, and it exists in ways we may not yet understand. A Sasquatch wearing a blue belt? In 1974, 2 young boys reported seeing a Sasquatch-like creature, only to be met with ridicule from friends and locals. The boys had been staying at an old hog farm in the Lost Creek Canyon area when they encountered the creature. They described it as massive, reaching a height of 9 feet, and curiously, it was wearing a blue belt around its waist. One of the McBride boys saw the creature on the farm's grounds, while his brother caught only a glimpse of it as it ran off carrying a pig. Not long after, 2 other teenagers came forward with their own eerie encounter. While parked in Plum Canyon one night, they were startled when the creature's face appeared outside their car, illuminated by the moonlight. The young girl, horrified by its presence, described its head as bullet-shaped and its face covered in hair. The creature stood between 9 and 10 feet tall. The moment she made eye contact, she let out a terrified scream, prompting the creature to flee. In August of that year, Bob Carossi decided to investigate the area where the teens had parked that night. During his search, he discovered a strange footprint, measuring approximately 10 inches in length and 6 inches in width. Some dismissed it as too small to belong to a Sasquatch, but I would respectfully disagree. Foot size can vary based on age, build, gender, and family genetics, just like in any other species. One local woman, Mrs. Adele Childress, not only believed the boys' account but also took particular interest in the strange blue belt they described. Determined to uncover more, she reached out to everyone involved. What followed was a series of bizarre and unsettling events that changed her life forever. When she later shared her experience with researcher Peter Gattilla, she recalled her distress. "What reason would he have for scaring me like that?" she said, wringing her hands nervously. "I've known him and his wife for 2 years. He wouldn't have told me such a story unless there was some truth to it." As she turned toward the window, she began to recount the strange and frightening warning she had received. It was October 1974. That morning after sending my son off to school, my husband Frank pointed out an article in the Saugus Newhall Signal. The headline read, "Does Bigfoot roam the Santa Clarita Valley?" The story detailed how 2 teenage boys, the McBride brothers, had reported seeing a strange creature carrying a pig away under its arm. As a member of a local group that investigates such reports, I decided to look into it. I contacted the owners of the ranch where the sighting occurred and went there to gather information. I learned that only one of the McBride boys had clearly seen the creature on the farm, while his brother had only glimpsed it as it fled with the pig. What truly caught my attention was their description of the glowing blue belt the creature wore. I brought this detail to my group, but no one had ever heard of such a thing before. It was completely new. After compiling my findings, I issued a press statement to the Signal, hoping someone else might come forward with similar experiences or additional information. Naturally, my statement was met with the usual jokes and teasing. My husband got a kick out of calling the McBride story hogwash, a pun I heard more times than I care to count. But my children took it seriously. They told me that their school friends, whose parents owned farms near the McBride property, had heard similar stories. Many of those accounts had never been reported publicly, for fear of ridicule. Then, a few weeks after my statement appeared in the newspaper, I received a call from some people claiming they had seen a UFO near a place called Texas Canyon. They described the object as disc-shaped, the Boundary Peak Bigfoot. I have been a police officer in Nevada for over 19 years. In 2004, two of my college roommates called me from Idaho and proposed a climb to Boundary Peak, the highest mountain in Nevada, standing at over 13,000 feet. Located in the White Mountains east of Bishop, California, it was a challenging but exciting destination. One of my friends worked as a loan executive for a bank in Idaho, while the other was a farmer. We set off from the Boundary Peak trailhead early on the last Saturday morning of July 2004, around 6 a.m. By 2 p.m., we were just a few hundred feet from the summit. The final 300 feet of the climb was steep, with narrow trails and plenty of obstacles. As we made our way up, we noticed two climbers descending toward us. We decided to pause and wait, allowing them room to pass. As we stood there, I spotted a lone climber making his way along the Rim Rock Trail between Montgomery Peak and Boundary Peak. He caught my attention because he dislodged a rock, sending it tumbling down the steep west side of the sheer cliff. Just as the two descending climbers reached our location, I noticed something moving about 300 feet below us in a large rocky bowl. The movement was too fast to be another climber, especially given the terrain. The area was covered in small shale rock, which is notoriously difficult to walk on without slipping, let alone move through at high speed. There were also several large boulders along the trail that this climber was navigating with ease. At first, I assumed it was an expert climber in a high-tech, hairy-looking suit. I even said aloud, "Look at that guy go. He's wearing a funny, hairy climbing suit." But as all five of us turned our attention to it, a heavy silence fell over the group. We sat there for nearly 2 minutes, watching in disbelief as the figure made its way toward the tree line below. As I observed it, I took note of several unusual characteristics. The creature ran on 2 legs upright, but would drop to all 4s when it encountered large boulders, climbing over them effortlessly before running again. It repeated this pattern, switching between 2 legs and 4, as it moved across the steep terrain. It was between 5 and 5.5 feet tall, with arms that hung down nearly to its knees. Its head appeared to be covered in long hair, and its body was a light brown color, with darker patches around the head and groin area. The entire sighting lasted about 90 seconds before the creature disappeared into thick vegetation. I turned to the other climbers and asked if they had any idea what we had just seen. No one responded. The first thing that came to my mind was that it looked like an orangutan. I mentioned this to one of my friends, who shrugged and said, "Yeah, maybe it escaped from captivity." And that was the end of our discussion. We resumed our climb toward the summit, while the 2 other climbers continued their descent. Before they left, I asked where they were from. They told me Southern California. As we made our way back up, I spotted the lone climber once again, making his way across the divide between the peaks. He was now about half a mile south of Boundary Peak. I couldn't help but wonder if he had unknowingly startled the creature from its hiding spot when he knocked that rock off the cliff. When we finally reached the summit, the lone climber caught up with us. He was an Asian man, and I asked him if he had seen anything unusual while crossing the south slope of the divide. He simply shook his head and said no. All 3 of us in my climbing group had cameras, but unfortunately, they were packed away in our backpacks at the time of the sighting. I briefly considered taking off my gloves, digging through my pack, and getting my camera out. But I quickly realized that without a zoom lens, all I'd capture was a dark blur from over 300 yards away. So I didn't even bother. When I got home, I only told a few close friends about what I had seen. I didn't want word to spread too far. After all, I didn't want people to think I was losing my mind. In February 2007, I purchased 10 acres of land about 5 miles from where I had seen the creature. At the time, I had no idea that this would be the place where I would eventually retire. While talking to a local resident one day, I mentioned what I had witnessed up on the mountain. To my surprise, they weren't shocked at all. They told me about a local prospector who had seen something in the forest, something that scared him so badly he refused to speak about it ever again. Here are some additional details about why we didn't investigate further. The terrain was too treacherous to attempt a descent to the area where the creature had been. Given the loose shale and steep incline, it simply wasn't an option. 4 other people saw the creature, my 2 climbing friends and the 2 climbers from Southern California. We all observed it for about 1 to 2 minutes. A local resident shared a story about a miner who had encountered something terrifying in the forest. The experience shook him so much that he refused to ever discuss it. 2 hikers have a close encounter with Bigfoot near Genoa. In September 1984, my friend Linda and I went hiking on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada mountain range, above Lake Tahoe and the Carson Valley, near the town of Genoa. Both of us had grown up in the area and were familiar with the trail, which was a strenuous climb leading up the mountain and over to Tahoe. Though I was known for being a bit of a troublemaker in high school, Linda had been our class valedictorian 5 years earlier, logical, level-headed, and not the type to be easily rattled. When we arrived at the trailhead, we noticed another car parked there. About a quarter of the way up the trail, we encountered 2 teenage boys running full speed down the mountain. The trail was steep, and they were moving as fast as they could. They stopped just long enough to warn us not to go any farther, saying they had seen some kind of monster. Linda and I exchanged skeptical glances. We assumed they had either been drinking or experimenting with something mind-altering. Trying to reassure them, we told them we were only going as far as the old deer hunter's cabin about halfway up the mountain. As they continued running down the trail, we laughed, joking that we wished we had whatever they were smoking. We reached the cabin without incident and sat on a bluff overlooking the Carson Valley, splitting a soda we had brought along. Feeling relaxed and alone on the mountain, I pulled out my recorder, a flute-like instrument, and played a few tunes. We spent about an hour puttering around before deciding it was time to head back down. That's when things took a strange turn. As we walked near the creek, gathering pine cones for an art project, I noticed an awful smell, something like wet dog or decay. I even checked my shoes, but there was nothing. Linda was facing uphill, and I was facing downhill as we inspected a particularly perfect pine cone when she suddenly gasped, "Oh my God, it's a bear. No, it's a guy in a bear suit." I spun around, and there, just a stone's throw away, stood a massive 7-foot-tall figure covered in hair. He was looking directly at us. To this day, Linda and I both feel as though something passed between us in that moment, an unspoken connection, almost as if we were all equally fascinated by one another. The creature stood across the creek, covered in dry, pine needle-colored hair that thinned slightly on his chest and face. His chest was broad, though not like that of a female. His long arms hung almost to his knees, and when he moved, his stride was long and fluid. His arms swung naturally at his sides, and despite the steep, pine needle-covered slope, he walked barefoot without slipping. As he turned to leave, Linda grabbed my arm and started pulling me down the hill, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. Even as we moved, he never stopped watching us. I never felt as though he meant us any harm. If anything, he seemed as curious about us as we were about him. His face was calm, almost serene, with intelligent eyes. He had a flattish nose, large eyes, and an expression that reminded me of an orangutan. The moment we started moving quickly down the hill, he did the same, only he kept to the ridge above, following us parallel to our path. When we reached our truck, we could still see him crouching on a granite boulder about a football field's distance away. On impulse, I called out to him, "You're very cool, but you shouldn't be scaring the crap out of us locals." Linda was having none of it. "Shut up and get in the truck," she hissed. That afternoon and evening, we were both deeply unsettled. We considered reporting what we had seen to the Forest Service or the Sheriff's Department, but we knew no one would believe us. Worse, if word got out, people might try to hunt him. Over the years, we've continued hiking there, always hoping to catch another glimpse. Now married with children, we take our kids up to what we fondly call Bigfoot Canyon, hoping to spot our elusive friend. A few years ago, after a storm knocked down several trees, a previously hidden area near the trail was exposed. Curious, we went up to investigate and found a large boulder surrounded by older pine trees with low-hanging branches. The space beneath the trees formed a natural shelter, and the pine needles had been trampled down as if something, or someone, had been using the area. It was perfectly shielded from the wind, an ideal spot for deer, bears, or maybe even Bigfoot. Seeing that creature changed the way I look at the world. Not only has it made for some incredible campfire stories, but it has also deepened my appreciation for the mysteries of the wilderness. Every rustling leaf, every unexplained sound now fuels my imagination. I truly hope no harm ever comes to these beings. I believe that the great creator of all life allows certain people to see Bigfoot, people who can grow from the experience. Linda and I certainly have. Even when we share our story with skeptics, it doesn't matter whether they believe us or not. We know what we saw. He was as much a part of the landscape as the trees, the sky, the creek, and the deer. Years later, I met an Austrian mountain biker who had a strange experience on the Tahoe side of the mountain, about 5 years before our encounter. He told me that while riding with his German Shepherd, he suddenly smelled something dead. His dog, which had been running ahead, let out a yelp, turned around and bolted back down the mountain without waiting for him. He said he felt like he was being watched, and that the hair on his neck and arms stood on end. He never saw anything but thought it might have been a bear, though the unsettling smell stayed with him. I hadn't told him my own story when he shared with me what he had experienced. Fishermen observed very large hair-covered bipedal figure near Burney Creek. Having lived in Northern California my entire life and being an avid outdoorsman, I can say without hesitation, or fear of ridicule, that Bigfoot absolutely exists. When I was 14 back in the summer of 1984, I went to Burney, California to visit my cousins. One afternoon, my cousin and I set out to fish for brook trout in Burney Creek. We wandered deep into the woods, moving from spot to spot along the creek, not paying much attention to just how far we had traveled. By about 4 p.m., we noticed it was getting darker. The sun had dipped below the crest of a mountain to the west, casting long shadows over the forest. That's when it hit us. We had ventured much farther than we had realized. Having left my aunt and uncle's house at 7:30 that morning, we were now deep in the wilderness, far from town. Not wanting to get caught out there after dark, we decided to stop fishing and just focus on getting back. As we walked, we suddenly heard something crashing through the buckbrush off to our left, on the other side of the creek. At first, we thought nothing of it, probably just a deer heading toward the water. But as we kept moving, we quickly realized this thing wasn't just heading toward the creek. It was moving toward us, and fast. A few moments later, we both noticed something strange. Whatever was making those heavy footfalls wasn't walking on 4 legs. The sound wasn't the rhythmic pattern of hooves hitting the ground. Instead, we heard 2 distinct, powerful thuds, spaced apart by about a second between each step. That was no deer. In an instant, instinct took over. Whether it was fear, intuition, or plain common sense, we didn't hesitate. We took off sprinting. Keep up if you can. That was the only thought in my mind as we bolted toward town. Adrenaline pumping, focusing on nothing but the path ahead. Being a couple of tall, thin teenagers, we covered ground quickly, driven by a deep, primal urge to get out of there. After what felt like forever, we finally reached the small gravel road where we had started that morning. By then, we were just a few hundred yards from town, completely out of breath. We slowed down, glanced back, and listened. Silence. The only sounds were our own heavy breathing and the steady rush of Burney Creek flowing behind us. The forest, which had been alive with movement just moments earlier, now felt eerily still. Then simultaneously, we saw it. Standing at the tree line near the creek, right at the edge of the small wooden bridge we had just sprinted across, was a massive hair-covered figure. And when I say massive, I mean huge. Its shoulders were nearly half the width of the bridge itself. The bridge sat 4 to 5 feet above the creek, yet the creature's waistline seemed just below the level of the bridge. That meant this thing was easily 8 feet tall, if not more. It just stood there, staring at us. And we stood there, staring back. For what felt like an eternity, nobody moved. No sound, no aggression. Just an intense, frozen moment of mutual observation. Then, without warning, it simply turned and stepped back into the thick brush. And just like that, it was gone. Neither of us said a word. Without hesitation, we turned and started a half-hearted jog back toward town, still trying to process what had just happened. 15 minutes later, as we walked through the front gate of my aunt and uncle's house, my cousin finally broke the silence. Completely unfazed, he turned to me and said, as calm as could be, "We're going to get yelled at for being gone all day." I ignored him. My mind was racing. Finally, I asked, "Do you think that was a Bigfoot?" Without missing a beat, and with a smirk creeping onto his face, he shot back, "Not as big as the foot my dad's about to put in your ass for losing his trout pole." True story.